Alright, so this whole video is based off of a recent interview with Furukawa. These things are very rare because he's always hidden in his corporate cave and only shows face once every few months during the full moon. How many people have gotten suckered into buying a Nintendo Switch 2 out of fear of a price increase? How many very confidently incorrect influencers, commenters, supposed experts have spent a better part of the last year really suggesting that you need to grab yourself a Nintendo Switch 2 as soon as possible because in their minds they believe that you need to buy it now, otherwise the price is going to go up. Back in April, there was a discussion around the tariffs, and everybody was convinced that the cheapest you would ever be able to buy the Nintendo Switch 2 would be in early 2025. And then sure enough, as we reached closer to the end of the year, we saw price drops and discounts on everything Nintendo related. Or rather, should I say, everything Switch 2 related. And then over the past couple of months, what are they calling this? The RAM-pocalypse? AI investments are causing some of the worst increases in the prices of electronics, and obviously those increases in prices are expected to be passed on to the consumers. So even while we were seeing with our own eyes, retailers dropped the price of the Nintendo Switch 2 during the hottest season of the year because they were struggling to move consoles since there was very little demand for them, the assumption going around was still very much that the price increase for the Nintendo Switch 2 was very much on its way. And while most of this discussion was going on, I found it to be a bit bizarre, because I was spending a lot of time talking about how the reason there were discounts and the reason the Switch 2 was struggling because the price was too high. And my argument was that with the decrease in price, the demand would increase, allowing more Switch 2 units to move off of shelves. And yet, people were very much adamant that whether we like it or not, Nintendo is going to increase the price of the Nintendo Switch 2. Even though we already saw 6 months ago, when the tariffs happened, they didn't do it back then. And now with the RAM situation, and with a very clear and evident proof to all of us that the Switch 2 is struggling in the markets in the West, I figured people would be a bit more careful to jump the gun on these statements. It just makes no sense to me, and I think it's because of my mindset towards how Nintendo is performing right now versus what others perceive to be Nintendo clearly paving nothing but a road to success. And I kind of covered this in a previous video a month or so ago where I went into a little bit more detail about why consoles prices are going up, and also why I felt very comfortable saying that I don't really think the RAM prices going up is going to make Nintendo increase the price of the Nintendo Switch 2 just yet. So I really don't want to regurgitate some of the discussions from that video again, but you can watch that one when you're done with this if you'd like. The reality is, it is my opinion that Nintendo needs people to buy the Switch 2 right now, and they're struggling to get people to do so. And this has been an ongoing struggle of them since early August, arguably even sooner than that. Because I was so confident in my assessment that Nintendo was struggling to sell units and needed more people to buy in, it also made me pretty confident that they would not increase the price of the Switch 2, because that would just make fewer people buy in. But most people out there don't think that Nintendo is struggling. Even now with the poor holidays, they think it's completely normal that in most markets, the Nintendo Switch 2 by the end of June was outselling what the Switch 1 did by the end of June 2017, by 2 or 3 times the amount that the Switch 1 had sold in that time frame. So basically, the Switch 2 did in its first month effectively what the original Switch was able to do in its first 3 months, mostly because they had the stock available from delaying the launch of that console. But either way, by the end of June, you saw a Switch 2 that was clearly well ahead of the Switch 1, and the assumption was that if it launched doing that much better than how the Switch 1 launched, then by the end of the year, how much higher than the Switch 1 can it possibly be? Clearly, there were not going to be any stock issues this time, so if it's already doubling the 2017 numbers at launch, by the end of the year, a lot of people assumed that it would be doubling the number of Switches sold again. But now we're seeing through all of the sold through data around the various markets around the world that the Nintendo Switch 2 actually had one of the worst holiday seasons Nintendo has ever seen. In pretty much every single location around the globe, all of those 2 times or 3 times leads that it had at launch is down to less than 10%, or in some cases, the Switch 1's 2017 actually ended up selling the Switch 2's 2025, even though it launched significantly slower. But despite this very clear sign that the Switch 2 is not moving and that demand needed to be increased, for some reason, people still assumed that RAM prices meant that Nintendo had their hands tied, many of which as early as a few weeks ago saying that they firmly expect the Nintendo Switch 2 to get the announcement of a price increase sometime in January of 2026. Right, I think that's what Asus did, so they assumed that, wait, everybody else is doing it, so Nintendo is clearly going to follow suit. But it just doesn't make sense. The reality is that Nintendo cannot increase the price of the Nintendo Switch 2. And it's not that they don't want to. Make that very clear. Furukawa stated that they had contracts, so the RAM price increases are not affecting them in the near future, but that's not how pricing your products in the supply chain works. You don't base it off of what you're paying for the consoles that are at hand, nor what you paid for the ones that you already have. You have to consider the market and the fluctuations that are going to happen in the market. This is why Nintendo increased the price of the Nintendo Switch 1 last year. How many do you think were already made? How many do you think they were planning on selling? It's not like they increased the price of the Switch 1 and they're like, hey, the stores on the next shipment are going to increase the prices. No, it was just like, this console sold plenty of units already. If people want to buy it, they're going to have to spend more money for it. That's just a sad reality now. It's the same reason why PlayStation and Xbox have increased the price of their consoles. They have a user base, more money is being made on the software sales. It's no longer worth them taking a loss on the hardware because they rather just sit tight, sell their games to their current user base, and then force people to pay more money if they want to jump in, but they don't really need to take an L or as big of an L anymore if those people are going to jump in. And what we're seeing with Nintendo, with both the Switch 1 and the Switch 2, and how they've reacted to market conditions, is a clear indicator of how they behave in two instances. You have a Nintendo Switch 1, where they do not need anybody else to buy in, because there are plenty of people out there to buy something off of the Nintendo store, and they are more than comfortable increasing the products over there, even though they had little intention of selling more than a few million units in an entire year. They will count every single penny. Any ounce of pressure put on Nintendo to decrease their profit margins will lead to a price increase if they can get away with it. And their increases of everything from the last gen console has more than proved that to us. In contrast with the Nintendo Switch 2, contrary to the belief of many, they cannot increase the price of that console because they are already struggling to move those units. So that means if there was a pool of maybe 9 or 10 million people able to buy a game, and they could hopefully increase it by a couple million over the next few months prior to the launch of the next major title, whenever that's announced, then by increasing the price of the console, they are less likely to gather a few million more users that are willing to spend the money on that software. So they know they cannot get away with simply increasing the price of the Switch 2. It's too risky. You end up potentially costing the next major title to not gain sales, or rather lose on potential sales numbers. To an extent, we've already seen this through the latter half of 2025. Hyrule Warriors, Kirby, Pokemon, and Metroid, pretty much all of them, in comparison to their franchises, have underdelivered. And a big reason for that is because Nintendo's greed has priced out a huge chunk of people that are willing to buy into those franchises. So how could a price increase possibly help their situation? Because now when like Mario Tennis Fever comes out, it's more likely to struggle more than Mario Tennis Aces did because of the cost of entry, not only for the console, but for the games. And if they increase the prices, it's going to struggle even more. This is all part of the same discussion that I've been having for the past year. It's pretty much the same concept as to why I knew there would eventually be discounts here in the West, and I still think there's going to be a price drop officially from Nintendo fairly soon unless something changes in their fortunes. In the same manner that it was clear to me that the Nintendo Switch 2 was not selling the way that the retailers had expected, and that's why they felt the need to drop their price and offer discounts through the end of the year. Likewise, I realized that Nintendo is still struggling, so how are they going to increase that price? Because that's going to make it even harder for these retailers to move these units. And the retailers are already going to feel pretty hard done because they expected these things to move at a better margin through the holiday season. So they're already probably going to have to slow down on the orders they make. This, of course, won't be made evident in the upcoming financials because what we're going to see in the upcoming financials in February are the shipped units from prior to the holidays. But the actual sold units from those massive numbers that they ordered worldwide, where the Switch 2 failed in every market in the holiday season outside of Japan, is much lower than whatever they ended up ordering for these quarterlies that's going to show up in a few weeks. Keep that in mind for later. So you can already expect a major slowdown in sales in January, February, March, but it's probably going to be an even bigger slowdown and an even bigger drop-off than anything we've seen prior because all of these companies have a surplus now after the holidays. Whereas the Switch 1 in 2017 and pretty much every major console through the first few years of its life generally sells out everything that it ordered in that holiday season. So even if Nintendo was to look at them and tell them to increase the price of their consoles, Walmart, Target, Amazon are going to be like, okay, buddy, here's what we're going to do. We're going to sell the consoles that we currently have at the discounted price that we're planning on dropping them. And then once you get your act together and make your console appealing for the masses, we'll make some more orders and sell it at the price that you'd like. Contrary to the belief of many, unless you're dealing with a catastrophic economy, which I realize this one is pretty bad, but I'm talking about levels of which people are ending up in the streets and rioting because they can't keep their electricity on. Unless you're in one of those situations and the product that you're selling is food or some other necessity, the cost that it takes to make your product does not necessarily determine determine the price that you can set it at. What determines the price is what gets it sold. And as long as you want to sell your product, it doesn't matter what you're dealing with, it's on you to navigate that and figure out how to make sure you're still profitable in order to make sure that the buyer is willing to spend the money to purchase it. And last I checked, people don't need to buy a Nintendo Switch 2, but Nintendo does need more people to buy a Switch 2 if they expect to release more Switch 2 titles and have those titles actually make the numbers go up. So the reason why the PlayStation 5 had a price increase, for example, is because they knew people were going to pay for it. People proved they would pay extra for PlayStation 5 when it launched. The reason why the Nintendo Switch never had a price drop after the pandemic is because the Nintendo Switch 1 was selling like crazy. Why would they drop the price? And likewise, applying that same logic, the reason why the Nintendo Switch 2 is not going up in price, at least for now, is because it's not selling well, and they can't let it sell worse. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, what if Nintendo had actually intended on releasing some major AAA title at the end of last year? Maybe Metroid Prime 4 was never supposed to be the holiday title. Maybe there was actually a 3D Mario in the works, or potentially already completed. And maybe Nintendo has a threshold of how many people they want to actually have bought into the Switch 2 before they release the game, just to guarantee those numbers, because that's the way they operate now. They don't take chances. It's entirely possible around September they saw how slow the Switch 2 sales were trending, and they're like, we're not going to release this now, let's save it for next year. Obviously, after that, the holidays come around. It's a poor holiday season. They expected that what they had was going to be able to be enough, and it wasn't. So now maybe they plan on releasing a 3D Mario sometime this year. But now they know that if they were to increase the price of the Nintendo Switch 2, they might actually have an embarrassing launch for a 3D Mario. Or even Pokemon Gen 10 coming up. Scarlet and Violet broke records. People were comparing Pokemon Legends ZA to Arceus, but we know that shareholders definitely had a sign of concern when they saw that it was one of the worst launch Pokemon titles. So if Gen 10 is going to be exclusive and they want it to live up to the launch that Scarlet and Violet saw, they can't alienate even more customers by pricing them out. Look, at the end of the day, every one of my discussions always comes down to something very simple. When there's demand, price goes up. When there's no demand, price goes down. If you increase the price of something that already is struggling to meet demand, that means you're going to have even less demand. And honestly, the reality is, and I felt this when the console was announced, and I definitely felt it during the time of the tariffs when Nintendo didn't increase the prices back then, and I will reiterate it right now. Nintendo knows they are laughing at people with the price of their Switch 2 console. They already know that they're overcharging for it. They already priced it with all of these buffers in there, with the expectation that either they're going to make a killing off of every console that's sold, or if something crazy happens, like Trump tariffs or increase in prices of RAMs, then they'd be able to eat the costs and look like the good guy, and make statements about how they're contracted for the price of their RAM for the next 3 to 6 months, as if the geniuses behind Nintendo's accounting team would not logically increase the price of the Switch 2 in preparation for that. We know they would. We know how greedy Nintendo is, and we know how ahead of the game they are with these things. I know a lot of people have been asking me why I don't think that the Switch 2 price is going to increase with the RAM. I don't know if this necessarily counts as an I told you so moment, because in a few months' time, that price could go up because of unforeseen circumstances. But at least for now, this is kind of something else that I think I was right about. It just logically does not make sense to me that Nintendo needs people to buy this console so that they could make their money off of their software, and that they'd be willing to increase the price of that unit. Even though, as most people have been calculating and so adamant about, it's going to increase the production price of the Switch 2 by like 41% or whatever. Trust me, they would increase the price if they could, but they can't get away with it, and they don't need to. They're making enough off the Switch 2s. The only thing people know for sure is that the Switch 2 has lower margins than the Switch 1. They don't actually know how much Nintendo is making off of the Switch 2. There are some uninformed estimates of people that assume that, like, if you or I decided to rebuild the Switch 2 based off of the price of the components, this is the price that we would get. But Nintendo is not paying the prices that Uncle Joe would make to build the Switch 2. They're ordering those parts in bulk, and they're building those things in bulk. It's much cheaper for them to build a Switch 2 than it is for us. But everybody always comes back to the fact that the Switch 2 has lower margins than the Switch 1. And to that I say, obviously they're going to have lower margins to the Switch 1. They were basically selling an Android tablet from 2015, a decade later, at the same price that they sold it in 2017. Their margins aren't bad, they're just lower than when they were ripping people off with the Switch 1 by still selling it for $300 in 2024. And if their margins and their profits were so tight, they would have increased the price of the Switch 2 prior to the launch of the console when the tariffs were announced. And especially now, with the increase of RAM causing their market value to tank in the stock market. But they're fine because they already ripped off like 10 million people. The bigger question that I have right now is not whether or not Nintendo is going to increase the price of the Switch 2. It's whether the increase of RAM prices is going to cause them to hold off on decreasing the price of the console. Because that's what I'm waiting for. That's what most people are waiting for. So we'll have to see how this goes. I don't think it's a coincidence that this very rare interview with Furukawa dropped, by the way. I think with all of the controversy going on around the Switch 2 between the poor holiday sales and the RAM prices and the drop in the stock value, they had to make some kind of presence, but they couldn't make too big of a deal about it because that would just make things tank and go crazy even more. So this interview kind of indirectly answers a lot of concerns that many people have after the holiday season without quite addressing them head on. But anyway, that's all I got for tonight. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.